One knows they're being recorded.
Yeah, thanks, June. So yeah, we are recording this meeting. My name is Oliver Pearson. I'm the program manager for the Lakes and Ponds Management and Protection Program at the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm going to hand it over to Jed Pfeffer, who is one of the organizers and brains behind this meeting, and allow him to say a few words, then we'll get into the program.
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. My name is Jed Pfeffer, and I'm a member of the Stewards of the Greensboro Watershed. And I just welcome all people that are tuned in here to this presentation sponsored by the Stewards of the Greensboro Watershed and the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. Tonight we'll hear 5 state scientists tell us about trends in Greensboro's watershed, fish biology trends, and opportunities for increased protection of our waters. We hope you enjoy this presentation and feel renewed to take action to improve our watershed. There will be a time after the presentation to ask questions, and as you heard already, this presentation is being recorded, so tell your friends. And if there are suggestions, you can email me at JEDT, as in Thomas, Pfeffer, F-E-F-F-E-R, at AOL.com if you have any suggestions, thoughts, or questions. So thank you.
Great. So thanks very much, Jed. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Again, my name is Oliver Pearson. I'm the Lakes and Ponds Program Manager with Vermont DEC. We do have a number of other state scientists and conservationists with us this evening who I'll ask to introduce themselves in a minute. I just want to go over some of the rules that we'll use to just make this virtual meeting experience as productive and as pleasant as possible. So for those of you that are on the phone, feel free to listen in. If I will, just so we don't have a lot of background noise. At the end, during the question and answer session, if you want to unmute yourself, you can push *6, and then you'll be able to speak. Then for those of you that are using Microsoft Teams, feel free to mute yourself during the presentations. And then when we get to the question and answer session, you can raise your hand. So if you look at the bar down at the bottom of your screen, there's a little hand. If you push that button, then I'll know that you want to ask a question. Or when we get to the question and answer session, you can just speak up, say your name. We'll get through all the questions. If there's a problem with connection and you miss something, feel free to interject during the presentation and ask the presenter to repeat him or herself. And hopefully this will work smoothly despite some of our bandwidth challenges in Vermont. So we have at least 3 other state scientists with us, possibly 4. So I just want to ask them to introduce themselves briefly. We'll start with Danielle, and then go to Stacy, Judd if he's here, and then Kelly, and then we'll get into the presentations after that. But I just want to let everyone who's presenting tonight and who works for the state DEC introduce themselves.
Let's see.
Danielle, did you want to start?
I was muted. Hi, everybody. My name is Danielle Ozarski. I am the watershed planner for the Lamoille River watershed, and Greensboro is located in that watershed. And you'll hear a little bit more about that when I speak tonight.
Thanks, Danielle. Stacy?
Hi, I'm Stacy Pomeroy. I'm the regional river scientist for the Lamoille River Basin, and I'll give a little bit of an overview of some of the streams that we've looked at in your community.
Thanks, Stacy. I'm not sure if Judd has joined us or not yet, but Judd, if you've joined us, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry for being late. I'm Judd Krotzer. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, which is in the Agency of Natural Resources along with DEC. I'm one of two fisheries biologists that are based out of St. Johnsbury, and our district includes Greensboro, includes the Lamoille River watershed down to Morrisville, actually. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Judd. And then sitting in her truck in the parking lot at the National Life Building in Montpelier, Kelly Merrill.
Hi, I'm Kelly Merrill. I'm an aquatic ecologist with the Lakes and Ponds Management and Protection Program, and I have the great privilege of getting to monitor all the lakes in the state for compliance with the Clean Water Act, specifically looking at trends and status of those waters. I do work on all those lakes except for Lake Champlain.
Great, thanks. So there's a couple other tips. Please remember to keep yourself muted unless you have a question. During the presentations, it would just be questions to let folks know that you couldn't hear them and ask them to repeat something. Then we'll do a question and answer session after the various presentations. We'll try to keep it relatively short, but we do have a lot of content to get through. So if something comes up, I suggest you write it down so you don't forget when we get to the Q&A. And then finally, if you're having bandwidth issues and your video happens to be on, you can turn your video off by clicking the little camera, and sometimes that improves the bandwidth issues, and you can see the screen more easily and hear better. So we'll hope that this goes smoothly. And with that, I'm gonna, you'll see the meeting agenda is up here. We've now completed the first agenda item. And so now we're going into review of Greensboro Watershed and key elements of the tactical basin plan for this basin, which includes the Greensboro Watershed. I'll hand it over to Danielle.
Yeah, if you want to go to the next slide, Oliver. So I'm really excited, all the people that showed up tonight. I'm kind of starting out by giving sort of the context, the overall picture of where Greensboro is overall in the watershed and thinking about how we manage waters in the state of Vermont.
Danielle, can I interrupt you for a second just to tell people how to see the slides instead of seeing the view of all of the different people that are on video?
Sure.
There's like a, you may not be, if you're not seeing the slides and you're just seeing a bunch of other people on the screen, look to your bottom right hand corner and then click on the image that looks like a slide with Waters of Greensboro on it, and you'll be able to see that instead of all the different folks, unless you want to just watch everybody else's expressions.
All right, thanks, Kelly. So
and Danielle, if you request control, you might be able to flip the slides through yourself if you need to.
Yeah, I only have two, so I think we should be fine. So I wanted to start off with a short little poem that I wrote about Greensboro and looking at the map of the waters that you can see for those of you who are viewing on screen. On the top right-hand side is the boundary of Greensboro and all the waters therein. Two watersheds, one big lake, one big river, a smattering of wetlands, a few other ponds, and lots of tributaries. So I thought that was just a really basic way for us to think about the waters, the surface waters in Greensboro. And that big lake, of course, is Caspian, and the big river is, of course, the headwaters of the Lamoille River. And for those of you who, aren't down with the lingo, a drainage basin, or also what we call a watershed, is any area of land where precipitation collects and drains off into a common outlet, such as a river, a lake, or other body of water. So what's neat about watersheds is that they can be nested inside of each other. For example, the watershed of Caspian Lake is part of the Lamoille River Basin, and the Lamoille Basin is part of the Lake Champlain Basin, which flows into the Richelieu River Basin in Quebec. And from there, the water joins the St. Lawrence River, which eventually drains into the Atlantic Ocean at the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. So they can be very large, they can be very small. Even your driveway has a watershed. And maybe you're familiar with Wendell Berry's quote, "Do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you." So this is a good thing, a good quote for Greensboro community members to think about when managing their water, since you are in the furthest upstream areas of 2 large watersheds in Vermont. Greensboro's waters are part of these 2 major drainage basins and planning regions. So as a planner, there's 5 of us in the state. There's 15 planning regions. So each planner has 3 basins, and one of them is for me is the Lamoille, and in Greensboro is a little bit in Lamoille and then a little bit in the Missisquoi Basin. So both of these large watersheds are part of the Lake Champlain Basin. The lakes, ponds, wetlands, rivers, and streams in Greensboro are all part of a complex connected network that functions together to provide flood protection, clean water, and plant and wildlife habitat, and many more values on top of that. Degradation of any of these streams or any of these systems has an impact to the larger watershed and your neighbors downstream. So the major lakes and ponds in Greensboro and the Lamoille Basin are Caspian Lake, Alder Brook Pond. You have 2 mud ponds. So mud ponds are pretty common in Vermont, but you have 2 of them, which is kind of neat. Horse Pond, which is considered the headwater pond of the Lamoille River, and Long Pond. And then in the Missisquoi watershed is Lake Elligo. And it's really neat because Lake Elligo potentially can flow either north or south, but mostly flows to the north into the Missisquoi watershed. So there's really most of Greensboro is in the Lamoille watershed, with the sort of northwestern section, or I'd say more like a little bit of the western section into the Missisquoi watershed. The major rivers are the Lamoille River, of course, Greensboro Brook, Withers Brook, Edson Brook, Sawmill Brook, Mud Pond Brook, Payne Brook, Tate Brook, Porter Brook, and Cemetery Brook, the latter 3 draining into Caspian. And Stacy will talk to you more about those rivers. And then you also have wetlands. So if you look at the map on the slide, the wetlands are the darker kind of greenish blue blobs. So we can't forget about wetlands because they are also surface water and do a great job of keeping our waters clean and also providing amazing habitat for animals and plants. So in Greensboro, you have a state significant cedar swamp at the southern end of Long Pond. You have an old growth cedar swamp as part of the Mud Pond Brook wetlands. And then you have a really nice wetland complex, which is a bunch of different types of wetlands along Greensboro Brook. So you can advance to the next slide, Oliver. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do. And part of what I do as a planner is develop tactical basin plans. And I do this with the help of the other folks that you'll hear from tonight. So tactical basin plans are plans to restore and protect the surface waters in a watershed. These plans identify the top strategies to meet our water quality goals, and progress is tracked, and the plan is renewed every 5 years. In the development of plans, we use monitoring data from the Rivers program, our Lakes and Ponds program, our biomonitoring section, and also volunteer monitoring data to assess the quality of waters and inform strategies in our plans. Where we don't have monitoring data, we make recommendations in the plans to carry it out. For example, the tributary monitoring for Caspian Lake that was brought up by one of your own community members, Stu Arnold, who is a lay monitor as well on Caspian Lake. And this was also supported by the Lakes and Ponds program. This monitoring, tributary monitoring, was a strategy in the 2016 Lamoille Tactical Basin Plan. The state has been conducting water quality monitoring on the lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and wetlands in Greensboro, and the overall water quality in this area meets the water quality standards. And you'll learn more about particular water bodies and monitoring efforts during this presentation. The top strategies for Greensboro are to maintain current water quality by monitoring and protecting water resources through volunteer and state monitoring efforts, to work on the lake-wise implementation efforts, so to do lake-wise assessments on properties and to do fixes where recommended, to participate in the municipal roads general permit and fix road erosion issues and do implementation to stop sedimentation and erosion in the watershed. And then riparian area and buffer protection, which Greensboro has protection within their town for not only the riparian areas around the lakeshore, but also around the rivers that come into the lake, and then also restoration efforts where they're indicated. So plans also identify focus areas and potential funding sources and partners. So these strategies in the plan that we identify, such as the water quality monitoring, are carried out by community members, members of select boards or conservation commissions, watershed groups, town and regional planning commissions, nonprofit environmental groups, and state and federal programs. And in most cases, it's usually a combination of those groups working together to work on water quality projects. The last Lamoille plan was developed in 2016. We are just kicking off the 2021 Lamoille Tactical Basin Planning process. So this is really great to be here and say hello to all of you at the start of this process. This plan should be completed by December 2021. So that would be a whole, around the calendar once into December. And it's part of the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL implementation plan, which is basically a plan that is for us to reduce the amount of nutrients and sediment going into Lake Champlain. And because of that, we have funding available to work on projects that do just that. And another thing that's important is that priorities identified in the plan, those strategies are eligible for that clean water funding. So we have different sources of funding, but that's one of them. So that's it for me in terms of planning. I'm kind of the one who works with all these different programs and brings things together, and am always here to help people out and point people in the right direction. So thanks so much for coming out tonight.
Thanks, Danielle. So I had to, it's a small technical difficulty here. So now we're going to move to the next part of the presentation. Just give me a second to tee this up. This will be Stacy Pomeroy speaking about rivers and streams in the Greensboro Watershed. So I'm trying to share my screen. Here we go. What you should see now is a slide with an overview of some of the Greensboro rivers and streams. And Stacy, over to you.
Okay, Oliver, I'm still seeing your screen. I'm gonna control so I can go through the slides. I'm still not seeing your screen yet.
Okay, you've requested control.
I have your screen, and so I think, now I'm not sure if I can change your slides though.
I can
not
change
able
them
to
for
change
you.
your slides.
Okay, I can.
Sure,
if
you're game for that. So
yeah.
Okay, what I see right now is tactical basin plans. So if you can go to the other way I can do it is that I can share my screen. I don't hear you, Oliver.
Okay, so I am sharing my screen with your first slide present.
Okay.
Try this again.
Yeah, Oliver, how about I just share my screen? Would that be? Can I do that? I think it'd be easier.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Stacy.
I'm not sure if it's me. Oh, okay, I'm going to try to share my screen with folks. Are people able to see my screen?
Well, we're seeing the icon of your river with the snow. which is usually a precursor to seeing your screen.
Okay.
That doesn't seem to be working, Stacy. So do you want me to go? Do you want me to go back to sharing mine and I can just click through it?
Let me try again. Yeah. Sure. Let's try again. Go ahead.
All right, working on it. So I have the PowerPoint presentation open to your first slide, and I just hit share screen, and you should see your first slide up on the screen now. Does anybody see a slide with two maps with a lot of rivers and some lakes, Caspian Lake included, on the screen? Kelly, do you see that?
Yeah.
I do.
Okay, great. So go ahead.
Yes, it's showing on the screen.
Okay, it's good you can see it because I can't see it. So I'm gonna open my presentation beside it, and hopefully I'll be able to see it soon here. So okay, so if you guys are looking at the first screen slides, you'll see it says Greensboro Rivers and Streams, and there is a picture of LiDAR. Which is kind of a three-dimensional view of, hey, look at that, I see it now on your screen. Perfect. So the LiDAR on the left side looking at the screen is the ability to kind of use what is basically a radar that flies over, gives us, think of your, what your policeman uses to see what you're speeding or not. It bounces back light. It gives us the ability to look at the landscape in 3 dimensions. And I brought this up just because that we have a couple different basins, and the green line you can see is the divide between those 2 basins. Your landscape is has mountainous and wide valleys, and your areas of streams are a mix between wide and narrow valleys. You can also see on the right side of the screen, your landscape is a lot of forest intermixed between agricultural and small amounts of development. And there are approximately 74 miles of stream length in Greensboro. So you have a lot of streams in your community. Okay, Oliver, to the next slide, please.
Yeah, so now it's showing a slide that says from Greensboro Town Plan, Rivers and Streams.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of a lag here, so I apologize with my my connection. So I went looking through kind of a bit about Greensboro Rivers and Streams, and the Greensboro Town Plan has some great information contained within it. You have a lot of high quality waters. You have some major tributaries to your Caspian Lake. You also have some major tributaries into the Lamoille River, as well as the Memphremagog Basin, which we'll look at in a moment. But I just kind of wanted to point out that your community recognizes the importance of your tributaries in your community, and they take that into account in the town plan. And that town plan then helps you folks recognize things that you want to see maintained and improved, and features that are of great importance. So there's some really great information in this little blip from the town plan. Okay, Oliver, you could go to the next slide.
Yep, now we got a map of the tributaries in the Memphremagog and Lamoille River basins.
Okay. So as Danielle mentioned, you have 2 major basins from which your tributaries contribute. You're the headwaters of the Lamoille River, and you're also in the headwaters of the Lake Memphremagog Basin. And the primary basin you have that you can see is Lamoille tributaries, but you do have a handful of tributaries that are in the headwaters of the Lamoille Basin. We're going to take a few moments and look through each of these little areas of your community to learn a little more about those streams in the watershed. Okay, Oliver, the next slide.
Good, got it.
So you have a handful of tributaries to the Lake Memphremagog Basin. You have Whetstone Brook and Whitney Brook, the Lake Elligo tributaries, and Alder Brook actually goes into the Lamoille, but it's right along that top edge of Lake Elligo. These tributaries are primarily in a forested watershed, but there are a few small areas you can see with agricultural development that could be areas that folks look at for vegetation enhancement. But for the most part, these tributaries are in very good shape. They have well forested watersheds, which helps maintain the water quality of those areas and contributes to the water quality benefits that these tributaries contribute into Lake Memphremagog. Okay, to the next slide, please, Oliver.
Yep, now we're on Caspian Lake tribs.
Okay. So a couple weeks ago, I met with the Greensboro Stewardship Group, and we looked at the streams and rivers in Greensboro. And so some of this information is just kind of helping capture some of what we looked at with the group, and also kind of some highlights from the town plan that was mentioned. And so as we move from the Lake Memphremagog tributaries, we're going to look at the Caspian Lake tributaries. And there are a few areas that these tributaries have the potential for looking at water quality considerations or even fish passage type of considerations. So in our, I keep trying to point with my pointer, but we'll kind of go from the top left and do a clockwise. So we'll start with Cemetery and Bachelor Brook. These tributaries, you'll notice in the top left corner, the road is purple. And what this is looking at is that there are sections of road that are considered hydraulically connected. And that means that water that runs off those roads has the potential to drain into these tributaries. And so when we look at Cemetery and Bachelor Brook, we're looking at the potential of road contributions to the water quality of these tributaries. We also note that there are some agricultural activities in the area, and this is being looked at by the water quality folks who are taking water quality samples. We also have some small development in the area. And what's a little harder to see is there is a small pond at the head of Bachelor Brook, which is to the, let's see, that would be the south of Cemetery Brook, the small tributary, unnamed tributary. And there's a small pond at the headwater of that tributary. And these type of small ponds can contribute to increases in temperature in the small brooks. So there's some consideration for how do we look at these small ponds in light of the tributaries that are coming in for consideration of water quality. We're going to go over to Tate and Porter Brook. These are more forested watersheds with more of the development happening right along the lake shore. But one of the things that was noted in the town plan was the fisheries consideration and the importance of connection of these tributaries to the Caspian Lake area. So what you can see in the picture are some little red dots, and I apologize, the gray dots are a little harder to see, but this is looking at the potential for aquatic organism passage, or in most of us, fish passage consideration. And so there are a number of culverts along these tributaries that may have limited or no ability to allow fish to move up and through these tributaries. So as the group looks at potential considerations for these tributaries and the importance of fish in the lake and in the tributaries, one of the things that we can look at is the consideration of how do we improve fish passage through improving our structures. As we move to the lower right corner to the Black Point Brooks, and I apologize to the group, I have forgotten the names of the tributaries that I think it's tributary 10 and tributary 6. Danielle, you'd have to help me here, but the Black Point tributaries are two small tributaries where there are water quality sampling. And what you'll notice is that one tributary is a little bit darker blue. This is actually a mapped tributary. And then there's a small tributary that is a lighter blue. And this is actually kind of an intermittent tributary that is being sampled for water quality. And this area happens to show higher concerns for potential impacts of water quality for the land use in the area. We can see that there's agriculture, there's a small section of hydraulically connected, and we also see those type of ponds again where there's limited vegetation and we have the potential for more water quality or more water heating temperatures. So this is an area where there will be some focus kind of looked at this year, maybe with a stream walk, to consider what are the opportunities for working with these landowners to improve the potential of water quality. As we move over to the bottom right corner or bottom left corner, the Greensboro Brook, this is in the village area, and this is the tributary that drains out of Caspian Lake. And in this area, what we really looked at with the group was the consideration of types of stormwater input to the tributary. And so from the village, you'll see all these little dots and red lines on the map. And these are types of stormwater inputs and drainage. And so as the community works for developing this area and the stormwater, taking care of stormwater, it's also looking at how does that stormwater feed into the tributary and what are ways to make sure that the stormwater entering the tributary is clean and are able to be diverted so that it doesn't impact the tributary. Okay, Oliver, next. Okay, so our larger basin is the tributaries into the Lamoille River. And so we're going to take a few moments to look at these different areas. So we have the drainages coming from Caspian Lake. We also have a number of small tributaries. We have Porter Brook coming into the Caspian Lake, which then feeds into Greensboro. Stanley Brook, which is a tributary to Greensboro. Whittier's Brook, Edson Brook, Sawmill Brook, Payne Brook, Mud Brook, which comes out of Mud Pond, and the Lamoille River. So we'll take a few moments and look at each of these kind of areas to think about a little bit more about the stream, and then what are some of the things that we looked at with the Greensboro stewards for consideration of what are tasks that the group might want to look at for water quality improvements and just getting to know your watershed a little bit more. Okay, Oliver, next slide.
We're on is this the Greensboro Brook slide, I believe is the next one.
Okay, it's just, I have a small lag. Oh, there it goes. Thank you. Okay, so Greensboro Brook is a major tributary coming out of Caspian Lake. It joins the Lamoille River in Hardwick, just south of Greensboro Bend. This is a primarily forested watershed. It's a beautiful stream. There are a few tiny spots where there's the potential for improving some riparian vegetation, which would also enhance the wildlife connectivity along the watershed. But one of the things I wanted to point out for the community that they may not be aware of is that the Vermont Fish and Wildlife has lands, a one rod, which is about 16.5 feet, along a large portion of the Greensboro Brook. And this is for fishermen, fishing ladies, access along the brook. So as the community is kind of looking at the rail trail, the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail, and as it's getting developed and the connection into Greensboro Bend, one of the highlights that you may be able to look at is the accessibility of Greensboro Brook through the Vermont Fish and Wildlife lands. So this is a great opportunity for looking at this stream. It gives people access on both sides of the stream to walk up and along the tributary for fishing purposes or just to even enjoy the stream. So a beautiful area to enjoy. Okay, Oliver, the next slide for me. Has it come up to Stanley Brook?
Yep, we're up on Stanley Brook.
Okay. So our next tributary, which is a tributary to Greensboro Brook, is Stanley Brook. And this was a site that caught my interest when I met with the group last couple of weeks ago because of the protected land through the Greensboro Land Trust, Bar Hill Natural Area. And one of the things that was really interesting is the large amounts of forest blocks. And this is also highlighted in your town plan. So as we looked at this this tributary, one of the things that was of interest to me was how is the connectivity for those forest blocks along this tributary. So there are a few locations where some enhancement of the riparian buffer would help have those connections between the forest blocks, and that allows larger wildlife to move more easily between those types of forest blocks. The other thing was that there are a few culverts where there's limited or no aquatic organism passage or fish passage. And so as a major tributary Greensboro Brook, having Stanley Brook as a connected both through the riparian vegetation and through the consideration of culverts that will pass fish and other organisms is really great, because then it will really connect your natural areas in a more holistic way. So this is an area that, as the community looks for types of projects, this may be a way to really enhance and build on the types of protected land that you already have by building on those connections through improved riparian buffers and culvert connections. Okay, Oliver?
Great, so now we're up to the Lamoille River main stem.
Okay. So the Lamoille River main stem is an area that's right along Route 16. It's in a narrower valley, and there are a few areas where the Greensboro group looked at for consideration of different types of projects. One of the areas we focused on was the Greensboro Bend Village area. This is an area where much of the Lamoille has limited riparian vegetation, and there's an opportunity to kind of work at a holistic community-wide basis for this. Currently, the state is helping with Lake Champlain Basin program funding to develop a program called Streamwise, and that program will be focusing on riparian vegetation and how to work with landowners, especially small parcel landowners or in village and urban settings, to enhance and improve riparian vegetation. And so the Greensboro Bend Village area is an opportunity for looking at those types of opportunities. As we move a little bit north of the Greensboro Bend Village area, there are a few tributaries coming in, and this is Edson and Withers Brook and Flag Brook. This is an area that has some limited riparian vegetation, so it's an opportunity to kind of, again, build connections along the riparian vegetation for forest block connections, that wildlife and fish passage, as well as enhanced wildlife or water quality benefits. This is also an area both in Greensboro Bend Village and along this section of the north of the village where there are some of that Vermont Fish and Wildlife One Rod. So it becomes access points for people who would like to enjoy the rivers out along that area. All right, Oliver, my last slide.
This is the Upper Lamoille River tributaries.
Okay. So this is kind of the last area we're looking at as we look across the 74 miles of tributary stream length that are up in Greensboro. So really the headwaters of the Lamoille River. It's a beautiful location, again, primarily forested. Some major ponds, Long Pond, Horse Pond, Mud Pond, which is just kind of off the screen here. The tributaries, Sawmill, Payne, Brook again, which is not marked, are in great shape. There are few culverts with limited or no passage to enhance those tributaries between the ponds and the Lamoille. And there are only a few small areas where there are less riparian vegetation that the group may look at for enhancement of land with those landowners. Overall, Greensboro amazing tributaries. The large portion of the tributaries are forested and well protected. There are limited areas where there are opportunities for doing enhancements. Things that the group and the community may look at is continuing to look at road networks along the tributaries for improving those roads that may drain into the rivers. Looking at the culverts as they are planned for continued enhancement of aquatic organism passage, and the small opportunities for enhancement of riparian vegetation. But overall, the tributaries in Greensboro are in great shape, and it's really exciting to work with the community to just focus on a few projects in areas to really enhance those streams overall. So I look forward to continuing with the group. Thank you very much.
Great. So thanks, Stacy. Appreciate that comprehensive overview of streams, tributaries, and larger rivers in the basin. I'll ask Judd Kratzer to give an overview of the fish populations in local streams and rivers, as well as the three principal water bodies that we're interested in tonight: Caspian Lake, Elligo Lake, and Long Pond. So, Judd, I didn't get slides from you, which hopefully that's what you were planning, so I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, sorry, Oliver, I was out in the field all day today. I do have slides. I emailed a PDF to you, so we could either, if you wanted to put that up potentially, or if I were to try sharing my screen, we could do that. Do you have a preference?
I just got your PDF, so mine seems to be working tonight, so I'm going to share my screen with your PDF, and hopefully everybody can see that. And just go ahead when you want to say next slide. But everyone should now be seeing a slide that says the fisheries of Greensboro and what we can do for them. Is that the case?
Yeah, I see that.
Good. All right, so Jed, I'm going to go to the next slide. Over to you.
Yep. Yeah. So so if you're on the outline now, so I just thought I'd talk about the fishes of Greensboro and our lakes and ponds and the streams, and then just talk about, and this is kind of general, threats to fish in general. Some of it will apply directly to Greensboro, some of it might not. And then what we can do to protect and conserve our fish. So you can go to the next slide, which we'll look at the lakes and ponds. And I always think it's, interesting and maybe somewhat helpful to have a historic perspective on what fish were in our water bodies to begin with. And we rarely, we really, our best case scenario is, sometimes we'll have data back to the 1930s. But even by then, and even starting in the late 1800s and certainly into the early 1900s, the state of the art for managing fisheries was to stock every species everywhere and let the best fish win, basically. Or actually, I mean, they didn't even probably think about it that way, as letting the best fish win. It was, I don't think they really had a concept of predation and competition and that kind of thing. But we do have, I have seen some old written records that are talking about Caspian. I believe it was the U.S. Fish Commission. They were, at a time, they were collecting large brook trout there and spawning them and taking the fertilized eggs to the hatchery to raise. And we know that lake trout were native there as well. There probably may have been, suckers and minnows as well, but that was probably the fishery before we messed everything up. So you can go to the next slide. And we still have lake trout that are reproducing naturally. In fact, we don't stock. Actually, we're not stocking anything in Caspian Lake right now. So the lake trout are reproducing on their own. We don't have brook trout to speak of, although very rarely one might get caught. But the rainbow trout and brown trout are there. They're reproducing on their own. They're using the tributaries to spawn. And then they grow to adulthood in the lake. So they get large in the lake, and then they come into the tributaries to spawn. The lake trout are spawning in the lake. We don't know for certain where exactly, but we see they seem to be spawning at least somewhat on the humps in the lake, on the rocky humps. They are not spawning on the shoreline, which they do in some of our other lakes. Rainbow smelt are there. That's the main forage for those fish, at least the lake trout.
Judd, I think you cut out.
Yeah, it seems like we lost Judd. Hopefully he'll come back in. Give him a second if he I don't want to go through his slides without him. So
All right. Yeah, sorry. It's I'm back. I'm having a little bit of connection issues, I guess. So
good. No, you're on the we lost kind of halfway through the Caspian current slide, but please continue. So we may have lost Judd again. Kelly, can you still hear me?
I can hear you, yeah, but we did lose Judd, I think. I can see the slides changing.
I'm back right now again.
Good. Okay. So I have you on the Eligo current slide.
Okay. Yep. We'll go there. So
all right. Maybe what I'll do to Judd is suggest that he call in, and while we're sorting that out, I think maybe in the interest of time, we can go to Kelly's presentation on water quality trends. So we'll try to come back to Judd's presentation later. He can call in, and Kelly, I'm going to stop sharing. It looks like you're way ahead of me. So super, Kelly, over to you.
Okay, folks,
If Judd can hear us, if he could mute, then maybe we'd have less background noise.
Okay, folks. Well, this is sort of a new way for us to communicate with the public and with each other, and we are, as you can see, still working the kinks out of that. And thank you all for bearing with us on this. I am excited to share with you some of the results we have on monitoring that my colleague Dr. Leslie Matthews and I have done on Eligo, Caspian, and Long Ponds in Greensboro. You guys are stewarding some really exceptional waters, lakes in the state, and I'm excited to share with you what we know about them right now. So I'm moving to the next slide, and hopefully now you're going to see a slide of very, very pea green water on the side of one yellow boom and very clear water on the northern side of that boom. If you're not, let me know. But in 1975, there was a seminal was published on the experiment that was conducted on a pristine lake in Canada. It found that phosphorus was a limiting nutrient to primary productivity and algae growth in lakes. 2 years after this publication, Ginny Garrison, one of my predecessors and our predecessors here at the department, created a monitoring approach for Vermont's inland lakes that measures phosphorus at spring turnover. Why spring turnover? Well, there's a unique property of water that basically sustains life on Earth, but it's that water has, its density is less when it's frozen. Hence the reason ice forms on the surface of our lakes. So when temperatures warm in the spring and the ice melts, it becomes denser until it reaches its densest condition at 3.8 degrees Celsius. I'm going to try pulling up a little pointer here. And essentially at 3.8 degrees centigrade, it is the densest it will be. So when that water that used to be ice starts to melt, it begins to sink to the bottom of the lake. And that's what causes spring turnover. And spring turnover is when it's very well mixed. And this is an ideal time to measure the phosphorus concentrations in a lake because it's not stratified like it is in the summertime or in the wintertime. Fall is also a good time to do it, but that's harder to sort of time from a monitoring standpoint. So now we have over data on over 400 lakes in the state and over 4 decades of spring phosphorus data on roughly 150 lakes, which are shown in the map on the right. Is everybody hearing me okay? I'm hearing some people maybe trying to chime in.
We're good.
Okay. So you'll see lakes are color-coded according to the lake class, a trophic status, a term used by lake scientists to classify lakes. The oligotrophic lakes are the low nutrient clear water lakes that have very little plant and algae growth and are typically support a cold water fishery. Both Caspian and Eligo are examples of this class of lake, and we know from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's 2017 National Lake Assessment that on a continental scale, there's only 10% of the United States' lakes are still in the oligotrophic low nutrient condition that Eligo and Caspian are. So that's 10% of the nation's lakes, at least the continental lakes, are still in that condition. The rest are either mesotrophic or eutrophic or hypereutrophic. Next, we have the mesotrophic lake class, and these are lakes with moderate nutrient enrichment. So they have some plant and algae growth, and then they have moderate water clarity, and they support mostly warm water fish. Long Pond in Greensboro is an example of a mesotrophic lake in Vermont. And it is also happens to be, the mesotrophic lake class happens to be the most widespread lake class in the state. As you can see here, we had the largest number of lakes that we have 40 years of data on happen to be in that mesotrophic range. Next, we have the eutrophic lakes, and these lakes are the more nutrient-rich lakes. They often have abundant plant and algal growth, reduced water clarity, and they support only warm water fish species. So when Ginny Garrison designed that monitoring program 40 years ago, she was really aiming at trying to get as much data on as many lakes as she possibly could in the state over time to see if we were seeing increases in phosphorus, if we were seeing eutrophication, if we were seeing lakes that had already been eutrophied and were very nutrient rich that we needed to take a closer look at. What she didn't do was pick a set of reference lakes to monitor continuously every year to determine, because the Clean Water Act and the Vermont Water Quality Standards evaluate whether waters are meeting society's expectation of them by comparing them to what is called the reference or natural condition. And to do that, you really need to monitor lakes in their reference or natural condition, because then you don't really know how far you've deviated from that. So in 2011, we looked for reference lakes throughout the state that met different class sizes and were representative of lakes across the state. And it was hard to find ones that were left in the natural condition. And Long Pond in Greensboro is one of these ponds, these 13 lakes that we identified from. And in some respects, its usefulness as a research reference lake is of the most important, I think, of the 13 lakes that we are monitoring, because it's representative of the mesotrophic lake class, which is the most common on the landscape. And it is, much of its watershed has been, to much of the work of people like you, has been conserved. Just like this little Clive Gray, who's on the call tonight, he shared with me the 1980 document that Charles Johnson, the naturalist, did about an ecological assessment of Long Pond. And one of the quotes in it that at the end sums it up, where he says, based on my field experience and communications with other knowledgeable field people, I conclude that no other lake of comparable size in northern Vermont possesses Long Pond's combination of truly outstanding scenery, the wild purity, variety of high quality natural communities, and potential as an even greater natural area. And then he goes on to really encourage people to conserve the land around the lake, encouraging the Nature Conservancy to do this. And he really strongly says that if that approach was used, he felt that based on the premises of preserving the natural qualities, he thought, quote, Long Pond could easily become one of New England's most valuable natural areas. I want to emphasize this because I now, this was written in 1980. Here it is, 2020. And this, I agree with this statement. And this lake is actually being used as part of a regional lake monitoring network. And I'll get into that in a second. Sorry, jumping ahead there. But first, we're going to visit the Vermont Lake Scorecard. And you're going to see this for the Eligo and Caspian as well. And what you see here is on the upper top left-hand corner, you're going to see a circle with 4 scores in it. A score for water quality trend, for shoreland disturbance, for aquatic invasive species, and for mercury. What you see here is that Long Pond is scoring very well in 3 of the 4 quadrants. So let's start with the yellow or the fair score, the one for mercury. So all lakes in the state, with the exception of 2, score fair for mercury. This pollution comes to our lakes primarily from atmospheric deposition. So think Midwestern coal-fired power plants. Now let's look at the quadrant entitled 8IS for aquatic invasive species. So to our knowledge, there are no known aquatic invasive species in Long Pond, so it receives a blue good score for this stressor. Next is the shoreland disturbance score, which is, I'm just having some lightning and thunder right now, so just a little distraction being in a vehicle. So anyway, but the shoreland disturbance score scores blue, which isn't surprising since there's no development on this lake, except for maybe up at this north end, there's like a little shed. But otherwise it scores good for that. If we look then at the trend score, it gets a good score for that. And why is that? Because there is no trend in going up and there's no trend going down. It's overall, statistically, it is a stable trend, and that is what we want to see. So that's what we call a good trend. And then if we go over here to the watershed is outlined in blue. Blue means it's getting a good score for the condition of the watershed. Overall, it meets the water quality standards, and we have no other stressors that we know of that are affecting this lake. So climate change is expected to extend the duration of summer stratification, which we talked about earlier with the whole mixing part of things. So the periods between mixings, periods where ice goes out earlier and ice is in later, the period of stratification in between is theorized to become longer. But to determine if that's happening in Vermont, we need to have sensor arrays deployed in our lakes that measure temperature and dissolved oxygen every hour, all year round, year after year. And in 2018, we deployed our first continuous sensor array on Long Pond in Greensboro. It was one of 3 arrays we deployed in the state. And it's now part of a network that's this regional monitoring network where there are 3 arrays deployed in New Hampshire, 4 arrays deployed in Maine, and just this year we deployed 2 more arrays in Vermont. Here's an example of the kind of view we get of stratification in the lake over the first 2 years of a deployment. The top of the graph is the surface waters, and the bottom of the graph are the deeper waters. The different colors represent the temperatures of the water over the last 2 years. In time, we'll be able to use this data to see how stratification patterns change and whether duration of the stratification is getting longer due to climate change, and whether or not it's becoming more stratified than it used to. We also have water level sensors on the array, and this data will help us understand how water levels are changing over time. We also plan to deploy a game camera this fall to track ice in and ice out. Ultimately, the data we collect from this lake is at risk if new human disturbances go into the watershed. Hence, to increase the protection of this water body for research purposes, there is a tool that the Clean Water Act provides, but that we have never used on a lake in Vermont. It's called the Outstanding Resource Water, or ORW designation, and water bodies can be designated as such for scientific research, and this is in our Vermont state statutes. Any proposed disturbances in the watershed would then need to be reviewed to determine if those activities would impact the parameters we're collecting to tease out how climate change is affecting the lake. Personally, I'd like to see all 13 of our research lakes in Vermont be designated as ORW, but to do that, it would need the support of the community and landowners in the watersheds of these lakes. And perhaps that is a possibility we can explore with you guys for Long Pond. Now I'd like to move on to Lake Eligo. Here's the Vermont Lake scorecard for Eligo. So similar to Long Pond, it scores good for water quality trend, for its shoreland condition, and fair for mercury contamination. It also, we see it scores a red or poor for aquatic invasive species, because a number of years ago it was invaded by the non-native nuisance aquatic plant Eurasian water milfoil, or Myriophyllum spicatum. The watershed is more disturbed than that for Long Pond and scores a fair score, so you see it outlined here in yellow, shown by the yellow line that outlines the watershed. And according to, we currently consider it meeting all of the standards. Last week, we conducted a plant survey on Lake Eligo. To do this, we laid a grid of points over the lake and visited each point, sampling with a rake. And we were pleased to find that of the 153 points, we pulled up the invasive non-native Eurasian water milfoil at only 2 of the points. And these are the plants. This is the whole haul of invasive species that we pulled out of that lake. We did see a couple of other single plants up in the north end, but otherwise the population seems to be kept in control by the native plants, as well as a number of years ago, apparently weevils were introduced that prey on the plant, and they need a lot of undeveloped lakeshore with duff material to overwinter, of which Eligo has a fair amount. Now here's the lake scorecard for Eligo again. I want to revisit the spring trend data. Using the Mann-Whitney U statistical test to test whether there is a significant trend or not, the test comes out with the finding that this trend is stable. We're currently wondering if this is indeed the case. And before I move on to why we are wondering about that, I'd like to draw your attention to the 3 summer data panels and how we have had no summer data collected on this lake for 20 years. And we could really use a lay monitor here, because that would help us determine if this oligotrophic lake may be one of those ones that we have been finding are experiencing increasing phosphorus trends. So in 2017, my colleague, Dr. Leslie Matthews, analyzed our 40 years of trend data, and we noticed some interesting trends. But originally, when she analyzed it all, we came up that close to 80% of Vermont's lakes did not have any significant increasing or decreasing trends. And we felt pretty good about that finding. But then there was this paper that came out just before we had analyzed the data. And that study came out that said that maybe we're losing our oligotrophic lakes on a continental scale. So we decided to take a closer look at the trends in our lakes depending on what trophic level they were in the 1980s. So this graphic shows you the trend in phosphorus over the last 40 years in the oligotrophic lakes. So just pulling those lakes out, those low nutrient lakes as of the 1980s. And we see those in blue on the left, and in the right, we see the eutrophic lakes. And what we found was that 96% of Vermont's oligotrophic lakes have shown a significant increase in phosphorus concentrations over the last 40 years. Meanwhile, 0% of the eutrophic lakes have shown an increase in phosphorus, and 8% have actually had significantly decreasing trends over the last 40 years. This approach uses a new statistical approach called a mixed effects model that is designed to be better at analyzing the type of data in our data set, and Leslie decided to use this in her analyses. While she was doing these analyses, another paper came out with a lot of authors, limnologists from North America on it, that used the exact same statistical approach, which gave us confidence that this was the statistical approach to actually use. In this approach, LGO is also considered to have an increasing trend, although by the Mann-Kendall test, it is not significant. So to help us discern, again, if LGO is beginning to see an increase in phosphorus, as suggested by the mixed model, we could really use a volunteer lay monitor on this lake again, since we haven't had one for 20 years. So if you want to know more about that story, John Dillon at Vermont Public Radio, thanks to Chris Owen, who is also on this call, did a piece on our findings last August. And you can listen to his coverage, which he does a much better job at of putting the story together than I just did, or you can read the transcript of it on the website above. He links also to our 2018 article that Leslie wrote for the North American Lake Management Society's Lakeline magazine on the topic. Now, I want to be very clear here. Vermont's oligotrophic lakes, including Elligo and Caspian, are still in fabulous condition. In fact, Vermont is stewarding some of the best lakes in the nations, as I mentioned earlier. We have some of the highest proportion of oligotrophic lakes in the nation, and we're ranked 4th in the nation for lake water clarity. So while we are concerned about the increasing trends, I want to emphasize that these lakes still have really good water quality, and our goal is to keep them that way going into the future. So it's 2020, 3 years after finding this trend of increasing phosphorus in our lowest nutrient lakes in the state, and we still don't know why. Current running theories we are investigating include the most common cause for increases in phosphorus, those related to land use in the watershed, along the tributaries, and along the lakeshore. It's also feasible that climate change may be increasing the period of lake stratification in the summer, with the potential to free up phosphorus that was buried in the sediments through release when the bottom waters become very low in oxygen and go anoxic. Or it might be that the increased intensity of precipitation events is resulting in more runoff entering these lakes. There are some other theories that have to do with recovery from acid rain, and then a phenomenon called lake browning. Then some researchers in Minnesota are investigating similar trends they're seeing in their remote undeveloped lakes, and they're looking into atmospheric dust. But regardless of which is the primary drivers of the increasing trends, our strategy is to begin outreaching to folks like you who care about these lakes to inform them of the trends we are seeing, with the hope they will help us identify sources of phosphorus to the lake and ultimately help to abate those sources. Practically speaking, this is what we'll need to do, even if it turns out that climate change or recovery from acid rain or atmospheric dust is to blame, as we want to flatten this curve regardless, and abating sources of phosphorus in the watershed is the easiest way we can go about doing this. So now we're going to move on to Caspian Lake. Here's the Vermont Lake scorecard for Caspian Lake. And if we start by looking at the 4 quadrats in the top left-hand corner again, like we did for Long and Elligo, we see that Caspian does not score as well overall as the other lakes. Starting again with the mercury score, like all but 2 lakes in the state, it scores fair for mercury pollution. Then moving to the AIS score, so far we see it scores good for blue because to our knowledge there's no aquatic invasive species in the lake. But next is the shoreland human disturbance score, and we see that unlike Long and Elligo, it scores a fair score for shoreland condition. And then next, if we look at the trend score, we see it scores fair for trend. Now, we're very fortunate to have a very long history of citizen lay monitors on this lake. So you'll notice that in addition to the spring phosphorus graph, we have graphs of data for summer total phosphorus, water clarity, and which is otherwise known as the Secchi, and the chlorophyll, which is a measure of algae in the water column. But what I want to really draw your attention to is the red color in both the spring and summer total phosphorus graphs. And this means that we're seeing statistically significant increasing phosphorus trends both in the spring and the summer in Caspian Lake. So now if we move to the watershed score, we see it gets a poor. It gets a highly disturbed red score for the watershed. And finally, we also list this lake as stressed for the flow alteration, the water level fluctuations it experiences that stress the aquatic life that use the nearshore areas, especially in the wintertime. So in 2019, we did a comprehensive 2-day visit to the lake, and I just want to check my time here, and to take a look at a variety of indicators on the lake. And what we found that was for every overall water quality indicator, the lake was in good condition. But the lake scored fair for lakeshore disturbance and scored poor for lakeshore habitat, shallow water habitat, and physical habitat complexity, which is a combination of the two, the lakeshore and the shallow water habitat essentially. So also in August of 2019, we visited the index site where we took a lot of readings there. And essentially all the water quality readings we took there were within the good range. The profiles we took, so these are at the surface to the very bottom of 42, 43 meters. We see these are very normal, what you would expect to see in a healthy oligotrophic lake. We see some very little evidence that there's less oxygen at the bottom than there is at the surface, but not that much. There is a little bit of evidence that maybe because there's less oxygen down there, we're getting a little bit of release of phosphorus from the sediments, but it's only 10 micrograms per liter, and that's not that much to be contributing for the change that we're probably seeing in the lake. But let's not discount that climate change could be having an effect here and that we might be seeing longer periods of stratification or lower dissolved oxygen levels in the bottom waters. We don't have much data to work with, but we do have all of these dates represents times that we were out on the lake and we were able to take those dissolved oxygen profiles. And in the bottom waters, we are seeing that since 1974 to 2019, we're seeing a general decline in oxygen readings that we've made over that period of time, suggesting that perhaps Caspian is seeing reductions in its oxygen, which could be due to climate change, but it could also be due to increased productivity that's due to increased runoff from the watershed. So now let's take a closer look at the lakeshore. So in August of 2019, so just last August, the University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Lab produced a very high resolution land cover data set for the entire state, which brought the resolution down from 300 meter pixel sizes to 0.5 meter pixel sizes. So they can pretty much tell what shoe size you're wearing now. And Colin Dowie from Vermont's Agency of Natural Resources Geographic Information System team took this high-resolution data set and analyzed the land use in the 250-foot buffer around Caspian Lake, the 100-foot buffer for all the tributaries draining into Caspian, and the entire watershed. And I got the results of this analysis this afternoon, so this is hot off the press, and you're going to look at it live with me here. So if we look at the land use within the 250-foot buffer around the lake, we see it's dominated by tree canopy, grasses, and shrubs. Hey, that's great, right? But within the 250 foot of the lake, of the 169 acres that makes up that buffer zone, about 10% or 16 acres is impervious surface as measured by this mapping exercise in the form of buildings, driveways, and roads. And about 5% or 8 acres is classified as hay fields. So I'll point out that while buildings followed by other paved, which is mostly driveway, make up the bulk of the impervious surfaces within 200 feet of the lake. So remember these numbers because we're going to revisit them again later when we talk about the watershed. So during our 2019 visit, we also conducted an assessment of 10 randomly selected sites from around the lake to quantitatively characterize the condition of the lakeshore and nearshore habitat using the methods developed by the Environmental Protection Agency's National Lake Assessment and Vermont Littoral Habitat Assessment. And these are the findings that I showed you earlier, that the lakeshore disturbance isn't fair, and that for lakeshore habitat, shallow water habitat, and physical habitat, Caspian scores poor on this scale that was developed for the nation. If we look at then some of these other parameters that we can compare Caspian to undeveloped shores in blue and Caspian's in green, we see that actually Caspian sediments are as embedded as undeveloped shores. Now, embeddedness of sediments is kind of a measure of like the amount of sediment runoff that might come off of a shore and bury the interstitial spaces between cobbles. And so the fact that it's less embedded seems to suggest that maybe there's not a lot of sediment runoff coming into the lake from the development around Caspian Lake. Another thing I'll just point out is that there's less trees and shading in the nearshore environment on Caspian than there is at undeveloped sites around the state. So all of this finding suggests that, basically it's not rocket science here. Obviously lakeshore development can have some impacts on runoff to the lake, and it's certainly worth looking at. The good thing about that as a stressor is that we've got all kinds of best management practices that Amy Peacock has worked hard to put together. She's thought of every type of runoff scenario you can imagine or source that a lakeshore property might contribute to a lake, and she's put together these fabulous fact sheets. And then she's doing the Lakewise program, which I understand Caspian is already invested in to some extent, and that's the way to move forward on that and make progress there. So now let's look at the potential sources of phosphorus that could be coming from the tributaries that could be contributing to the increased phosphorus trend we're seeing in the lake. So the dominant land cover again is trees and shrubs. But of the 200 acres of land that make up the 100-foot buffer, all of the streams draining into the lake, only about 2% or 5 acres is impervious surface, whereas 25% or 69 acres total are in agriculture. And that's within the 100-foot buffer of the tributaries. And so I'll point out that while impervious surface does make up a big percentage, not a very big percentage of the land covered near the streams, the roads do make up the majority of it. But the big one here is that within these tributary buffers, apparently there is what maps out as agriculture very close to those streams. So during our 2019 visit, we sampled the 5 tributaries that we could find. That intermittent one that Stacy talked about, we didn't come across that. We didn't know about that one to sample. But you can see at least, there were deltas at all of these tributaries, suggesting that lots of sediment is potentially coming down these from these tributaries. And if we look, basically, we were able to, at the inlet, what we're calling inlet number 4, we were able to drive a metal pole into the sediment about almost a meter's depth, suggesting that's a source of potentially fine material upstream. We also had a pretty big, our biggest delta was off of the inlet number 2 there. And then if we look at the nutrient concentrations at the inlets, what we had in the open water at the deep hole index site, we see that all of the tributaries are contributing higher nutrient water than that found in the open water. Inlets number 2 and 6 had the highest phosphorus readings. And if we look at chloride, now this one was interesting to me. So typically when I'm sampling lakes across the state, a lot of times all I get for chloride concentrations is 2 milligrams per liter, background level, unless unless roads are contributing in some way to runoff, especially in the wintertime, or if the roads are treated for dust with chloride in the summertime. And what we're getting is, even in the open water, the deep water here, we're getting levels of 7 milligrams per liter of chloride. And at site number 4, we actually got a reading of 15.5 for milligrams per liter of chloride. With the exception of inlet 1, all of the inlets had elevated chloride levels, suggesting that upstream there's some sort of connectivity with roads. All right, and then finally, this conductivity corresponds with that. All but inlet 1 had more elevated conductivity levels than we had at the index site, which is shown here. Another indicator that it's worth looking upstream, as you guys are already doing with Stacy and with Danielle, for sources. And then finally, let's take a look at the watershed as a whole and see if there are any possible sources worth exploring in the watershed. Again, the dominant land use is trees and grasses and shrubs. We're not in New Jersey, so this is reassuring to see in graphs as well. But here we do see a little bit deviation from what we were seeing in the other 2 graphics. We see that 25% of the land use in the watershed is in agriculture, or maps out as agriculture. And while there's very little impervious surface overall, it's only 6% of the whole watershed. It is what impervious surfaces there are is really dominated by the roads. And so let's compare that to the 250-foot buffer around the lakeshore itself, which is dominated by buildings, the impervious surface. And instead of making up 25% of the land area, agriculture, or what maps out as agriculture, only makes up 5%. Whereas instead of being just 2% of the land area is impervious surface in the whole watershed, 10% of the land area in the 250-foot buffer of the lake is impervious surface, dominated by buildings, about 7 acres worth of that. And if we look at, which is actually half of what the acreage is so there's 16 acres overall in the whole watershed, and almost half of the buildings, the percent cover of, percent area of buildings in the whole watershed are concentrated right around the lakeshore. We know this, but the development around the lakeshore in Caspian is some of the most densely developed area in the whole watershed. And then finally, the tributaries, we see 10% is impervious surfaces as well. That's much more than the whole watershed as a whole. We seem to be putting our impervious surfaces in closer proximity to our streams and our lakeshore, for the streams, it's dominated by the roads, but it's mostly dominated by some agriculture very close to within 100 feet of our streams. So, okay, I've only got a couple more slides. What are the potential drivers of increased phosphorus levels on Caspian Lake? We pull this all together, And we know there's runoff from the shoreland development, roads, agriculture, as well as climate change are all in the mix here. But the good news is that we can turn these trends around. And we know this, and I can say this because about 10 years ago, we brought this same story to the Lake Seymour Association. And those guys hit the ground running and did a lot of work. And it was a lot of hard work. It was not easy. And they had very little to no funding to do it. But they have been able to turn their trends around and flatten their curve. We now have the passage of Act 76 last year, where there may be some resources available. Of course, that was pre-pandemic, so I'm not sure. But if nothing else, if Seymour was able to do it without those resources, you guys can too. And hopefully we can maybe garner some of those resources. There's this great checklist of protection actions that Amy Peacock put together for if you're seeing an increasing trend. It talks about having septic socials and some of the things you guys are already doing. So just to sum up, I'm sorry I've talked to you guys for so long and so quickly. The Greensboro Watershed is really home to 3 lakes that really are unique on a statewide scale. I want to emphasize that. Long Pond in Greensboro is the largest, most pristine example of a natural mesotrophic lake in the state. It serves as a sentinel for climate change as part of both the state and regional long-term monitoring efforts, and it will help us answer the question as to how the baseline is changing in our lakes and help us understand if climate change is lengthening the length of summer stratification, and it will help us understand how natural water levels are changing over time with climate change. And then both Ellico and Caspian are oligotrophic lakes, and only 10% of the continental U.S. lakes are still in low nutrients as these 2 lakes. And unfortunately, we're seeing a significantly increasing in Caspian Lake, and summer data is needed on Ellico to determine whether a similar pattern's happening there. So there are a number of ways in which citizens can help these 3 exceptional lakes. They can support increased protections of Long Pond in Greensboro through the designation of it as an outstanding resource water. They can find a volunteer for Ellico to help sample it weekly in the summer. They can find a volunteer willing to make the trek into Long Pond weekly in the summer as well. They can support protections of Caspian and Ellico through reclassification to A1 for aesthetics use and fisheries use, something Oliver's going to touch on. And they can share the BMP fact sheets with lakeshore residents to help them find and abate phosphorus sources on their properties. And because roads are an important player in this, working with your road foreman and trying to find those hydrologically connected sections is going to be important. And then we're continuing Danielle Ozwarski, Stacy Pomeroy, and Amy Peacock is going to be key. So I think you guys are on a good start, and I hope that some of you are still on the line. Well, it looks like at least a couple of you are still out there. At least I see Clive and Rick is still awake and stuff. So that's good, guys.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. I got disconnected for a second, but I'm back. So thanks for that detailed overview. And I just have a few more slides to round out the presentation here this evening, and then we can get into the question and answer session. So I'm going to share my screen as well, and we'll sort of wrap up the presentation section of our session this evening. So hopefully folks are now seeing the original meeting agenda, and we're at this last section, which is tools available to protect and restore Greensboro waters down there in yellow. Are people seeing that? Is that coming up?
Yep,
Great.
I'm seeing it, Oliver.
Okay, excellent. So what we want to get into next is a little bit about, as Kelly mentioned earlier, reclassification, which is a process defined in Vermont's water quality standards, which itself is derived from the Clean Water Act, to maintain existing uses, and that can be done through a number of ways via increased protections. And so reclassification is not the same as the outstanding resource water designation that Kelly mentioned earlier. It's a different tool that under Vermont statute and through the Clean Water Act we have at our disposal. And so, basically all waters of the state shall be managed to support their designated and existing uses. And there's a number of defined existing uses, which I'll get into in a minute. And the basic goal is the state should manage its water bodies to maintain those uses and over time to reduce risks to those uses. And so there's both some maintenance as well as sort of an upgrade goal with our statewide water policy. And by classification, we mean what classification can be attributed to a designated use for a body of water. And so, for example, there's boating uses, recreational uses such as swimming, contact in the water. There's use of waters for enjoyment of aesthetic conditions, which I'll talk about. But really importantly as well, there's use of waters for protection of aquatic habitat and use of waters for protection of aquatic biota and wildlife. So that's a range of some of the existing uses which are defined in the water quality standards. And part of this as well is this principle of anti-degradation, that existing uses of waters and the level of water quality necessary to protect those uses, existing uses, shall be maintained and protected. So that gives you an idea of the state's approach to managing its water bodies. And out of the gate, all waters were classified as B2, which is sort of the basic level for maintenance of these existing uses. But we left space to upgrade water bodies into higher classifications with more with better attributes linked to the existing uses. And so, for example, the highest classification is referred to as A1, and the second highest is referred to as B1. And so the general goal with an A1 water, if a water was to be classified into that designation, is that water shall be managed to achieve and maintain excellent biological integrity, aquatic biota, and wildlife, and consistent with waters in natural condition. And so as you think about Greensboro Watershed, you can think about which of our lakes and ponds and other river reaches and stream reaches and wetlands are really still in what is referred to as natural condition. And then B1, the next tier down, as you can see here, is very good. So not quite natural condition, but still very good. And so, as I said, some of the different uses are use of waters for fishing, recreational uses, aesthetic conditions, aquatic biota and wildlife, aquatic habitat, etc. And so, one of the ways to look at maintaining or protecting an existing use in our water bodies is looking at use of waters for fisheries. And so this is a picture of a yellow perch that was caught in Caspian a number of years ago. You might know this individual. I think it was a record-setting size. And so what we're trying to achieve with our fisheries is to maintain excellent quality fishing consistent with the natural condition in an A1 water or very good quality condition of fisheries in a B1 water. And another piece of our classification for fisheries habitat is that if it's a cold water fish habitat, we don't want to see any increases in ambient temperature from this natural condition. And so if you're going to look at a water as an A1, it has to be water that there's no external sources of temperature increase. So what we find in your watershed, and maybe if Judd is on the line, he could briefly continue his presentation, is that in the Greensboro watershed, you have lakes with adequate natural reproduction of lake trout to provide quality angling opportunities without stocking. And Caspian is an example of that. And in Caspian, there's this whole range of fish species that you see up here on the screen, and Eligo is listed up there as well. Let me see if Judd is with us. He may have called in by telephone, and if he wanted to make a few points that he wasn't able to make earlier in his presentation while we're talking about protection of water quality standards for fisheries uses. Judd, are you still there with us?
Yeah, I'm on the phone. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not even looking at the screen anymore because it's not working for me. So do you have my presentation up right now?
Yeah, what I'll do is give me a second and I'll pull it back up. And if you want to make a few key points from that, go ahead. I just got to find it here. It'll just take me about 10 seconds to bring it up.
I think you made some of the main points already, Oliver, that having naturally reproducing lake trout populations is a unique and special thing and an important thing to protect. I guess, the main thing I would say about that is that we have lost reproducing lake trout populations in other lakes. And we think that in some of those cases, it's because we lost, because of too much nutrient input, which resulted in lower dissolved oxygen in the deeper parts of the lake. Lake trout, the rainbow trout, the brown trout, they all need cold water and they need high oxygen water. And that's usually going to be down deep in the lake. And so if that's where your cold water is going to be, if there's not enough oxygen down there, you're not going to have your trout. So we want to make sure that we keep our nutrient levels down low enough so that we have adequate dissolved oxygen down there in the depths.
And so, Jed, what I have up on the screen is one of your last slides that says sensitive species and threats and talks about exactly those 2 points.
Yeah, good. That's a good place to put it. I mean, we looked at some of the streams with Stacy's presentation. Basically, I mean, we don't really need to look at those. Wherever we sample in Greensboro, we almost always find at least one trout species. All 3 stream-dwelling trout species are present in Greensboro. It's brook trout, brown trout, rainbow trout. We don't stock any of the streams in Greensboro, so these are all naturally reproducing populations. You also have slimy sculpin in a lot of these streams. And, what's good for water quality is good for trout. So we're all aligned on that. We want to reduce the amount of sediment that's washing in, which can suffocate eggs, and because these need to spawn in the stream, their eggs have to incubate in the stream bed. So if there's a lot of silt and mud coming in, those can suffocate the eggs. So we need to make sure that we have minimal sedimentation coming in. A lot of the streams in the state have been affected by past land use practices, and some I don't think so much in Greensboro, but in other places we've had log drives and things that have affected what we see today in our streams, and a lot of them are over wide and shallow, whereas what's best for fish and especially for trout is tends to be narrower, deeper streams, and some of that's just because in the past we've clear cut our forests and cut the trees right on the stream bank, and have affected the hydrology such that we now have channels that are kind of over widened, and that contributes to increased water temperatures. Also, when having removed trees from stream banks, that allows the sun to shine in and can potentially warm the waters. A lot of the streams in Greensboro have good forested watersheds, which is good. We want to keep it that way. And then access to habitats. Talked about aquatic organism passage, and that's exactly what this is. There are barriers to movement. These are often culverts which prevent fish from moving upstream to accomplish different parts of their life cycle, whether that's accessing cold water or spawning. And then, and so I've already talked about the threats to the lake-dwelling fish. I talked about lake trout. The brown and rainbow trout have the same thing that affect the lake trout, and because the brown and rainbow trout of Caspian Lake spawn in the tributaries, they need good water quality in the tributaries and in the lake. I think that's probably what I need to say, so thank you.
Good. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to quickly flip back to the presentation I was making, then we'll wrap it up. Give me a second to make this transition here. Hopefully you're not falling asleep as we finish up. So I'm hitting share on the screen, selecting this one. Good. And so basically, what the point to take home with reclassification for fisheries is that the state's water quality standards require these existing uses to be maintained, and there's steps we can take or that you can take, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to both maintain the existing situation and then increase protections of different water bodies in your watershed to enhance the very high quality waters, or just maintain these very high quality waters so that this existing fisheries uses of your waters can be maintained and those fish can thrive. Another approach that the state came up with that is not perfect, but it does give us some quantitative nutrient concentration targets to work from is we came up with a system to rate the water quality linked with aesthetic uses of lakes and ponds. And I won't go into detail about how we did that, but essentially we asked people who were lay monitors working on lakes and ponds across the state to sort of rate water quality, and we linked those sort of visual ratings with the total phosphorus concentrations in our lakes and ponds, as well as nutrient response conditions, other characteristics of lakes that are linked with phosphorus concentration. And we came up with a table that you see on the right here that sets concentration thresholds for the different classification categories, A1, A2, B1, and B2 for our lakes and ponds. And so what this allows us to do is to say, look, there's an existing use, which is aesthetic use of our lakes and ponds, that people want there to be high aesthetic quality of these water bodies, and therefore we need to be able to maintain that, and we can define which category the aesthetic qualities of a given water body are based on their total phosphorus concentration and or some nutrient response conditions. And what we see by looking at the monitoring data is that Caspian, where we have a lay monitor, where we have years of data, is that the mean summer total phosphorus concentration of 9.3 parts per billion is well below the A1 threshold, and below is good. It means that it exceeds, its water is the sort of the purity, if you will, of the water is where it needs to be in the highest designation for water quality in the state of Vermont. And the state or the local organizations or yourselves could take action to reclassify Caspian Lake as A1 and put in some additional protections, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Eligo, we don't have the summer data that we would need to declare that it's eligible for reclassification to A1, but the spring monitoring data that Kelly and Leslie have collected, make us think that it's probably eligible for reclassification to A1, but we need to do some summer monitoring to confirm that. And then Long Pond, its mean spring total phosphorus is a bit higher at 15.5 parts per billion. So that might be eligible for reclassification to B1. There's obviously some sources in the tributaries for Long Pond that are driving those total phosphorus concentrations there up a bit. And again, summer monitoring would be needed to confirm that. And so, I've spoken a little bit about reclassification, but what does it really mean? Why would we bother doing this? What are the benefits to a lake or a pond, and what are the benefits for people who are interested in improving and maintaining high water quality to doing this? And so, we see reclassification as a process that should lead to increased protections for A1 and B1 lakes to maintain that excellent water quality that those lakes currently possess, and to maintain those existing uses. And the state talks a lot about, well, if you're going to increase protections, what are the management implications of those increased protections? What are we talking? Are we talking about reductions in uses? Are we talking about limited development? Are we talking about putting in extra best management practices so that any surface water runoff that might come into this lake is filtered and slowed down, and the sediment and or the nutrient pollutants that surface water runoff might carry is prevented from entering a lake or a pond. And those are all possibilities. And this table on the right, which is very small, gives an idea of across different management types in a lake and its watershed, be it silviculture or logging, agriculture, different types of road and building developments, discharge of solid waste, etc. What distractions for B1 lake or pond could be. And so really, that's something that we're still working out, what exactly an A1 or B1 lake means in terms of additional protections, but we have some ideas, and we can discuss those with you at a later date if this is something that folks in the Greensboro watershed are interested. There is a process for reclassification, and this is defined. First, we have to use our data to confirm the eligibility for reclassification. So, for example, if we were reclassifying based on protection of these aesthetic uses, we would use the total phosphorus concentrations to determine if it's eligible for A1 reclassification or B1. And similar, if we are reclassifying to protect fisheries uses, there's some clear criteria there as well. Once we know that the data confirms that a given water body is eligible for reclassification, there's two different approaches that can be used. Organizations or individuals can petition the state to reclassify, and that's happening right now with some streams down in the Ripton area of sort of central southern Vermont, or the Department of Environmental Conservation can lead a reclassification process. The process itself is very consultative. We have to reach out to our sister departments in Forest Parks and Recreation and Department of Fish and Wildlife for their input. There's public hearings involved, and eventually we present our recommendations on reclassification to some legislative committees in Montpelier. And really local support for this process is key. And we wouldn't really engage in a reclassification process as the DEC without that. Has this been done in Vermont? Yes, but so far only in wilderness areas within the Green Mountain National Forest, where there is very high quality waters, where giving them some additional protection seemed like a good idea, but there also weren't any really conflicting uses. And so there wasn't any local opposition or differences of opinion about whether or not these lakes should benefit from additional protections. Finally, looking at the data, looking at the local interest in protecting the water quality, Caspian could be a great trial case for reclassification to A1 and trying to get these additional protections in place. And we can talk more about what that means. I want to wrap up to get into the question session. So we're gonna stop there. Thank you very much for your attention over the last essentially almost 2 hours. Much appreciated. And I'll hand it back to Jed if he wants to say anything. Otherwise, I can facilitate a question and answer session. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And what we can do is, if you have a question, you can either use the raise hand function on Microsoft Teams, which is a little hand at the bottom of the bar. We can start with that. If you're on the phone, you can unmute yourself and just raise your voice and let us know you have a question, and we'll go from there. First, I'll just give Jed a second to respond to this cornucopia of information that's come your way, and then we can get into questions and answers. So I'm not hearing Jed, so hopefully he's still with us. If you're on the phone, Jed, and you've muted yourself, you can push *6 to unmute yourself if you want to say something. Otherwise, we'll go.
Hello?
Yeah, hello.
So basically, no, just to thank everybody for giving the presentations and for everybody for showing up to witness them. And I could just start off with a couple questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my first one was on these lake report cards. Are those updated? How often are those updated?
Okay, do you want to do your second question as well, then we can answer both of them?
Sure. Let's see. Oh yeah, what is the classification for Caspian Lake now?
Okay. Kelly, you want to take the first one?
Sure. So we had originally set up the lake scorecard that our plan was to update it every 5 years, but now my colleague Leslie Matthews, who does all of the magic of the analyses and stuff, has figured out how to do it much more quickly. So we're updating it every year. We try to get it updated by March before we go out again and collect data for the next year. So it's updated annually now.
And Kelly, is that easy for us to find, the lake scorecards? How do we?
Yeah, so if you Google Vermont Lake Scorecard, you'll get to a page that will have you, if you don't already have Google Earth on your phone or on your computer that you're using, you can download, there's instructions on how to download Google Earth, and you can, then you can surf around the whole state and take a look at how other lakes are doing in the state compared to the ones in your region. And I think when you do that, you'll see just how good the lakes you guys are stewarding are doing as well.
And then for your second, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just wondered is there such a scorecard for rivers as well?
If Stacy's on the line, maybe she could take that one.
Hi, yes, I'm on the line. At this point, there is not a type of scorecard like that for the rivers. We do have stream geomorphic assessment information, which I neglected to show is along the Lamoille. We collected that in 2009, so it's a little older data that does show the general condition for both habitat and the physical conditions of the stream. So that is something I can send to the group to link you up to that information. But we don't have a scorecard quite as nice as Kelly's.
And then to your second question, so what the Vermont Water Quality Standards does is that every water body is sort of de facto classified as B2, which is sort of the basic level to maintain existing uses. And then water bodies can be reclassified to a higher classification level or as an outstanding resource water if the data supports it and if there's local interest and support to do that. And what's great, linking back to what Danielle said earlier, is that the tactical basin plans are a good document to define water bodies that are eligible for reclassification based on what we know about either the aesthetic uses or fisheries or other data on other uses, and then put in place priorities for additional protection via reclassification. So we've been doing that in more recent tactical basin plans, including one that Danielle finished recently. And as she works on the new tactical basin plan for your area, I'm sure that'll be part of her efforts with you. We don't have to wait for that to get started, but the tactical basin plan should contain specific recommendations, for the agency and for the public for reclassification to protect high quality waters.
Hey everybody, it's Danielle. I just wanted to jump in. For rivers, there is biological information and chemical information available. I'll put the link in the chat. It's called the IWIS database, and you can just type in Greensboro, Vermont in the where section, and it pulls up all the water quality data that we have in Greensboro. So you can click on the river sites and find information about the rivers, and that's something we can explore a little bit more if people want to in the future.
So the floor is open for others that have questions. I don't see any raised hands in the team function, so we can. I see a raised hand from Mr. Clive Gray. Go ahead, sir.
This is a question for Kelly about monitoring on Lake Iligo. If I were to send you the list of houses, landowners, and addresses on Iligo, could you perhaps just circularize them and see if anyone's willing to help with your summer monitoring on Iligo?
You're muted, Kelly.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So yeah, Clive, if you want to do that legwork, that would be fabulous. And it's interesting. We were sort of surprised, Leslie and I, when we went to look at that data recently, that we had no lay monitor on there because, 20 years ago we did, but 20 years goes by fast, and so it's time for to see what's happened on that lake. So yeah, if you could collect that, that would be fabulous, Clive.
Okay, I'll be happy to do it, and I'll email you.
Sounds good.
I would say, just to add briefly, this summer, because of COVID, we, instead of doing the sort of chemical parameter monitoring total phosphorus concentrations and chlorophyll A concentrations on 75 lakes, we were only able to do it on about 25. But next summer, we want to get back to doing those detailed analyses on 75 or more lakes, and we're trying to bring in additional lay monitors into the program. So that would be great if we can find someone together for Eligo. And I also think that as you interact with your legislators and you see the importance of monitoring, just encouraging them to support these types of monitoring efforts as they do our budget annually wouldn't be a bad thing either.
I'd like to say something. I'm Amy Papineau, and my husband and I live on Eligo. And so I may save Clive some legwork, because I think we would like to volunteer as lay monitors.
Great.
So who do I speak to in order to do that? Or who do I contact?
Amy, did you RSVP for this meeting?
I think so, but I honestly do not remember.
So the lay monitoring coordinator position is vacant right now. We had a great guy in that position who took a job in New Zealand in February, and so right now myself and my colleague Angela Shamba are filling in and running that program. And then once we get the data, we'll definitely enlist the likes of Dr. Matthews and Kelly to help us analyze it. So Amy, you can reach out to any of us in DEC Lakes and Ponds program, and then we'll get you set up for beginning lay monitoring, train, equipment, etc. for next spring.
Okay. Thank you.
And if folks are interested as well, there's some new information in the chat, but so you could ask a question in the chat if you like, or you can just ask a question verbally.
And just a reminder for those of you on the phone, you have to hit *6 to unmute yourself.
And so I think while folks are perhaps, I'll just fill in the space for a second before we wrap things up. We were definitely interested in working with you to continue our monitoring work, to continue to understand the trends in the rivers, with the fisheries, with the lakes and ponds up there. And we're also interested in DEC in working with you to increase the protection of these high quality water bodies in your neck of the woods. So if that's something that the stewards of the Greensboro Watershed or other individuals up there are interested in, please reach out to us as well. I'll be quiet now and let anyone who wants to ask a question go ahead.
Hey Oliver, this is Stacy. I just wanted to mention that I will be working with Jed and the Greensboro stewards to look at some locations to do some stream walks later this fall, to look at some of the areas that were highlighted in the presentation, but also just for the group to look at some of the beautiful locations they have along their stream. So once we kind of coordinate some dates, we'll figure out how to reach out to folks and let folks know that those are happening, and look to report back later this fall or early winter with that type of information.
Super.
I have a question about monitoring. One of them is, do you have a lay monitoring program for streams?
Yeah, so to the best of my knowledge, we don't have a statewide lay monitoring program for streams right now. So what we're doing with lakes such as Caspian is doing tributary monitoring, and so Stu Arnold and Danielle have been involved this summer in monitoring a handful of tributaries into Lake Caspian, looking at a couple different parameters of interest to get a sense for where sources of total phosphorus might be coming into Lake Caspian, and they can speak about that. In previous years, and hopefully in the future as well, the state has run what's called the La Rosa grant program, which in the past made grants to local conservation organizations to go out and do stream monitoring, analyze the samples that were collected to look at, again, different parameters of interest in those water bodies and get a handle on the health of these streams and surface water runoff, and what was happening in storm events, and what was happening during base flow, and how that links with water quality in both streams and then downstream water bodies. So this year that's on hold, again, because of COVID, but we hope to start that up in some form again next summer. I don't know if Danielle or anyone else wants to talk about other aspects of stream water quality monitoring.
I don't have anything to add. I think it would be really neat, though, if we could have something like that for the state. But I think something that's important to know is that there are many, 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 many more rivers than there are lakes and ponds. So we just have to have a different process of how we'd set something up like that. But that would be great. It just really comes down to having funding and the resources to do it.
So at this point, we would have to wait until next summer to get involved with some lay monitoring of streams. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, there's already a little bit going on Caspian's tributaries, as we said, and you could learn more about that from Stu Arnold or Danielle, and if that's something there was local interest in replicating on either Eligo or Long Pond, and we could to have the funding to pay for the chemical analyses of the samples that are collected. What's been fascinating this summer is, in the absence of the La Rosa program, some lake associations have decided that it was important enough for them to know what was going on in their tributaries, and they began to collect water samples using the La Rosa program sort of quantitative approach, and then paying for the analysis of those samples at the State Agricultural and Environmental Lab in Randolph themselves, and getting the data, and then we're able to help them interpret it and understand what it means, and then define some management actions to reduce any problems or any threats that are identified in that data. So seeing sort of local organizations take control of this in the absence of the La Rosa program in lakes where we weren't able to do it as DEC was really great. So DEC is doing tributary monitoring in 7 lakes this summer, and there's a few other lake associations. One of the lakes, either Fairleigh or Morey, I can't remember which one, and then Fern Lake near Lake Dunmore as well.
And Lake Morey.
Thanks.
Would the stream monitoring on Long Lake involve a boat, or is it something that can be done for shore? Because it's quite a long hike into there.
The stream monitoring can be done, in the tributary. People often take samples at the mouth of the tributary, which can be done on foot, usually with boots or waders on or whatever. And sometimes there's reasons to take samples further upstream. But typically, go ahead.
But what we're looking for on Long Pond, Jed, is someone to do the coordinated lay monitoring program out on the lake. So yes, it would require a boat. We thought we had someone who was going to be able to do that last year lined up, but it is a pretty big commitment to haul a boat down there with you, portaging or 4-wheel driving down there. So it was a little bit more of a commitment than I think that volunteer had signed up for. But if there is someone who's really looking for an excuse to get to Long Pond every week, we might give you a pass on a couple of weeks so you didn't have to get down there every single week. But I would love an excuse to go down to Long Pond on every week, and so there's got to be somebody else out there that would want to do that too. So if you come across anybody like that, that would be fabulous. And have any ideas? I know Clive was looking into that as well, trying to find somebody.
Yeah, I think if I had a very light boat, I'd be game for it, but I don't have anything that light to take back there.
Great. We'll just see if there's any last questions or comments from our participants at this point.
I think Chris
I see
Owen
Chris
had his
Owen.
hand up.
Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Hey, I'd only like to say that there's a tremendous amount of talent and passion among the state staff and scientists, and it's wonderful to run into you around the field while I'm working on behalf of Native Fish Coalition. So keep up the good work, and let's hope we get good engagement. And thank you for your long hours today.
Thank you. And I agree. The group here tonight I'm new to this group, but it's a fantastic group of committed and really passionate people, and it's infectious. So you can't help but get excited about protecting these high quality waters when you're around this group of people. And for the fact that I think that speaks to the participants as well. You all hung in there for over 2 hours late in the day, so we thank you for your interest as well. Maybe with that we can wrap it up, and I'll give Jed the floor for a sec if he wants to give any final words of wisdom, and then we can say goodnight.
Yeah, no real final words of wisdom. I'm just really glad that we could pull this off, and hopefully, we have a email list of sorts from the group. Yeah. And you could still RSVP if you wanted to be on that list. We would have hopefully some future events that we would, contact people about. So this is just really the beginning of something, in terms of improving the watershed. So thanks again, everybody, for being part of it, and have a pleasant evening.
Yeah. And we'll compile everyone who RSVP'd and get that list going, and we'll once this recording is downloaded and then re-uploaded to a website, we'll let folks know where it is, and we'll stay in touch that way. So once again, on behalf of the state employees this evening, thanks for joining us. Please reach out to us if you want to pursue any of the ideas that we've talked about this evening. And we look forward, as was just said, to bumping into you when we're out on your beautiful waters up in Greensboro. With that, I'm going to sign off. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the evening.